The spring equinox, also known as the vernal equinox, is one of 2 times in the sun's annual cycle that day and night are equal in length, but it's from here that the days become longer so that light becomes greater than darkness and life springs forth following the death of winter. The spring equinox was celebrated by ancient peoples for thousands of years, and millions still celebrate it as part of their ancient traditions, such as Native Americans, Europeans, and Iranians. Additionally, Easter, which marks the death and resurrection of Jesus, is held soon after the spring equinox in the Northern Hemisphere and is commemorated by around 2 billion Christians. This theme is not unique to Christianity, as many ancient gods were celebrated as resurrecting at the spring equinox. Some of the most enigmatic and advanced ancient sites align to the spring equinox. The world's most famous ancient monument, the Great Sphinx of Egypt, gazes directly at sunrise on the spring equinox, which, as we'll see, was connected to the resurrection of the Egyptian god Osiris thousands of years before Jesus. The largest ancient monument in Ireland is aligned very closely to spring equinox, and it too contains symbols of resurrection. At the Temple of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, which is the world's largest religious structure, the equinox sun rises to rest momentarily at its peak, signaling the triumph of light over darkness and the return of the gods to heaven. Other sites that align to it are the largest man-made mound in North America and the largest ancient temple in Europe. Clearly, this was an incredibly significant time for ancient people across the world, and continues to be for many. In this video, I'll explore these sites and more to uncover why the spring equinox had such an important spiritual meaning and still holds it for us today. This is a massive topic, and I can only cover so much in one video. Everything I discuss is found in more detail in the books by myself and my husband Mark, particularly Ancient Solstice, which is based on material we first published between 2011 and 2013. The spring equinox is a special time when light overpowers darkness and life overpowers death, in nature and symbolically within us. The spring equinox generally occurs between the 19th and 22nd of March in the Northern Hemisphere and the 20th to 23rd of September in the Southern Hemisphere. It's one of 4 major transitions in the Earth's journey around the Sun. Because of the obliquity of Earth's orbit, the Sun's influence on Earth waxes and wanes in a cycle that forms the basis of our year, which is expressed in the ancient yin-yang symbol. This illustrates how the year can essentially be divided into a light half in which the days are longer than the nights and a dark half in which nights are longer than days. Between the extremes of most darkness at winter and most light at summer are the 2 crossing points, the equinoxes, when day and night are equal. After the autumn equinox, darkness becomes greater. But at spring it's the reverse, as light becomes greater than darkness, appearing to overpower it. These crossing points were seen as highly significant by ancient peoples, particularly in the ancient religion of the sun, which spread around the world in prehistory and gave rise to some of the most incredible megalithic sites in the world, and many traditions that still venerate the sun and celebrate the solstices and equinoxes. I pieced together the surviving history of this religion in my book of the same name. In this religion, creation and all of its cycles were understood as being imbued with spiritual principles, and thus the sun's annual journey was seen as having a spiritual meaning. Every year, the sun appears to make a journey through the sky. As a source of greatest light and life, the sun was used in ancient religions and mystery schools to represent the higher being or self of each person that was seen as residing in heaven, or which someone could reunite with, like the Ark of ancient Egypt, the Fravashi of Zoroastrianism, and the Atman of Hinduism. It was symbolized in numerous cultures as a sun god who went on a heroic journey, which matched the journey of the sun as it progressed from darkness to light, thereby symbolizing the attainment of enlightenment and heaven. These gods have been referred to by scholars as dying and rising gods, and the structure of their quest as the hero's journey. The lives of these heroes often followed a similar pattern, in which they were conceived by the divine, died after undergoing great trials, descended into the underworld, resurrected, and then ascended to heaven. These key events also often corresponded to the major transitions of the sun at the solstices and equinoxes. with their resurrection occurring at the spring equinox. We refer to this journey as the path of the spiritual sun. My husband identified it in his sacred sun path theory. This knowledge formed the basis of the ancient religion of the sun and its mystery schools of initiation. Many dying and rising gods were depicted as descending into the underworld at the autumn equinox after being killed, as this is when the sun descends into the dark half of the year, symbolic of the earth, underworld, matter, body, tomb, subconscious, and womb. At the spring equinox, this sun god then often triumphantly emerged from the underworld to resurrect and later ascend into the eternal, spiritual realms of light at the summer solstice. Resurrection was central to the life of the Egyptian god Osiris, just as it was in the lives of Jesus and the first father of the Maya. The lives of these deities, although appearing in different cultures and times, essentially symbolize the same thing. Today, the spring equinox is still celebrated by indigenous peoples across Russia and Europe, such as the Slavs, Celts, Norse, and Greeks, and many indigenous peoples of North, Central, and South America, such as the Maya and Aztecs, as part of their ancient traditions. It's an official public holiday in Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Albania, where it's called Nowruz. It's one of the most important festivals and marks the start of the new year. Nowruz has very ancient roots, as it's a surviving vestige from when the ancient religion of the sun had predominated in these regions. It was instituted as a religious holiday when Zoroastrianism was the state religion of the Persian Empire. Zoroastrianism is an offshoot of the ancient religion of the sun. It's still practiced today by over 100,000 people, and the spring equinox festival of Nowruz remains its most holy day. With the advent of Islam, however, for most, Nowruz is now a non-religious cultural holiday. Zoroastrianism is thought to have been founded as far back as around 1500 BC, making it one of the oldest continuously practiced religions in the world. However, it derived from the even earlier Indo-European religion in the region, in which the sun god Mithra was central, and I suspect his resurrection had been celebrated at the spring equinox, as his birth was and still is celebrated at the winter solstice. The origin of Nowruz is traced all the way back to the first man, who survived a large-scale cataclysm, when it's said he was raised into heaven where he shone like the sun, in order to end a terrible age of winter that had threatened to kill everything. This may refer to the end of the extremely cold period known as the Younger Dryas at 9700 BC, when global temperatures rose. This man is recorded as then having re-established civilization and the ancient solar religion from before the catastrophe, along with its celebration of the equinox. Hannah M. G. Shapiro, who is a contributor to the Zoroastrian Educational Institute Volhuman, describes the meaning that the spring equinox holds to Zoroastrians, who venerate the sun as an expression of the divine, saying, "In Zoroastrianism, light is a great symbol of God and goodness, whether in the light of the sun or in the sacred fire. The spring equinox and the lengthening of the days is thus a symbol of the victory of light over the cold and darkness of winter." This victory was portrayed in reliefs at the ancient city of Persepolis in Iran, which was built for the celebrations of the equinox once held there. Yet though the ancient religion of the sun no longer predominates in this region, many traces of it remain. For example, the symbol of the winged sun disk found engraved at Persepolis, depicting the Fravashi, is still a national symbol in Iran, and the imperial throne of Iran is called the Sun Throne. There are numerous sites across the world that were built to align to the equinox. Any site that aligns to the spring equinox also aligns to the equinox in autumn, as in both cases the sun rises and sets due east and west. However, the spring equinox is associated with sunrise, as this is the time in the sun's daily cycle that corresponds to it, being when daylight increases. The autumn equinox corresponds to sunset, when it's the reverse and darkness increases. And so the sites I'll list here are aligned to the equinox sunrise. Those that align to sunset, I'll leave for the video I do on the meaning of the autumn equinox. I'll run through them quickly, and then focus on a few of the most spectacular to show their symbolic meaning. Some of these sites are the oldest, most advanced and enigmatic in the world, revealing just how spiritually significant the spring equinox was to ancient peoples. They include the Great Sphinx in Egypt, Angkor Wat, Cambodia, Tikal, Guatemala, Monk's Mound, United States, Noth, Ireland, Kanti, Ireland, Manadra, Malta, Nebelivka Temple, Ukraine, Ponkri Budwadi, India, Canapple and Arthur's Seat Alignment, Scotland, Crianan of Ailech, Ireland, Marmed Canyon Dolmen, Russia, Kokino Megalithic Observatory and Sacred Site, Macedonia, Chaco Canyon, United States, and Uaxatan, Guatemala. I'll now look at some of these sites in more detail. They encode a complex symbology, so bear with me as we unravel it to discover the spiritual meaning of the spring equinox. Perhaps the most spectacular alignment to the equinox occurs at the ancient temple complex of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, which is the largest religious structure in the world. It was built by the Khmer people around 1150 AD under the reign of King Suryavarman II, whose name means protector of the sun. Its design is based on ancient Hindu cosmology, and the entire complex is dedicated to the Hindu sun god Vishnu. On the morning of the spring equinox, as the sun rises, it appears to rest momentarily atop the peak of the main temple, crowning its pinnacle in a remarkable achievement of engineering and a beautiful display of symbolism. We realize that at this moment the structures of Angkor Wat bring together the components of an ancient Hindu myth known as the churning of the Milky Ocean, using the earth, sun, and stars. This myth has a hidden astrological as well as profound spiritual meaning, and understanding it is key to discerning the meaning of the spring equinox. A giant relief illustrating it is carved into an eastern wall of the temple, and part of it is illuminated by the sun on the equinox. In this myth, the gods and demons engage in an epic tug of war, using a serpent wrapped around a mountain, resting on the back of a turtle, swimming in the ocean. As they pull back and forth, they churn the ocean. At first, their churning causes a terrible poison to emerge, then treasures, and finally the nectar of immortality, which is eventually consumed by the gods, allowing them to defeat the demons and return to heaven, and for the god Indra to reclaim his position as king of heaven. The mountain of this myth is represented by the main tower of Angkor Wat, as it was built to symbolize the sacred Mount Meru, specifically its spur Mount Mandara, which is used to churn the ocean. In ancient Hindu texts, Mount Meru is located at the North Pole and is said to reach up into heaven as the axis of the world. The turtle that it balances upon is symbolic of the earth, swimming through the Milky Ocean, which is actually the cosmos shining white with stars. The demons are the dark half of the year, and the gods the light half, which alternate back and forth on either side of the equinox. This is revealed in the mural at Angkor that portrays this myth, as discovered by scholar of Southeast Asian studies Eleanor Manika, who has deciphered the symbolic numbers encoded into the measurements of Angkor in her book Time, Space and Kingship. She realized that the number of demons to the left of the mountain are equivalent to the number of days between equinox and winter solstice, and the number of gods on the right to those between equinox and summer solstice, making the mountain and pivot point the equinox. Each side of either demons or gods measures 54 cubits, which correlates to the average maximum annual arcs of the sun and moon. Together they add to 108. The numbers 108 and 54, along with 72 and 36, have been incorporated into the design of Angkor Wat and surrounding temples. The author Graham Hancock highlights the fact that these numbers are part of the mathematics of the phenomenon, known as the precession of the equinoxes, an astronomical cycle the Earth completes approximately every 26,000 years, in which the constellation the Sun rises with on the spring equinox changes. The location of the sky that the Earth's poles point towards also changes very slowly as part of this cycle, tracing circles in the sky as they do. The constellation Draco, which is depicted as a dragon or serpent, appears in the region of the northern circumpolar stars, where it literally wraps around the center of the circle that the North Pole traces through the sky in its precessional cycle, even appearing to gradually turn around it over time. And so the constellation of Draco is the celestial depiction of the great serpent in the myth. Additionally, Graham Hancock, Samantha Fire, and John Grigsby discovered that Angkor Wat and around 15 surrounding temples mirror the constellation of Draco as it would have appeared in the sky at the time of the spring equinox in the year 10,500 BC, thousands of years before they're said to have been built, as documented in the book Heaven's Mirror. King Suryavarman apparently intended the building of Angkor Wat to initiate a new golden age, as well as revive its ancient religion, and so perhaps it had been built over a more ancient site. This site appears to have some connection to Egypt, as Angkor Wat is intersected by a line encircling the Earth upon which many other ancient sites with solar alignments are intersected, including the Great Pyramids and Persepolis. As Hancock and Fire point out, Angkor Wat is also located 72 degrees of longitude east from the Great Pyramids, and 72 is a key number in the precession of the equinoxes, which both sites encode, as the Earth cycles through 1 degree in its precession every 72 years. Additionally, they notice the name Angkor has a meaning in ancient Egyptian, which is the god Horus lives. This is intriguing, given that Horus is an ancient Egyptian sun god who was central to the beliefs in spiritual resurrection and the spring equinox. Angkor Wat is an incredible sight which illustrates the cosmic cycles Earth transitions through using the sun and stars themselves, with the mountain as the main peak of the temple, the Earth as a turtle, the serpent as the constellation Draco, which is even mirrored by the surrounding temples on the ground, the gods and demons as the light and dark halves of the year on either side of the equinox, which are also depicted as giant statues across some of the bridges leading to the temple, the night sky as the ocean, which may have even been reflected by an inner section of the temple that was flooded, and represented by the moat encircling Angkor Wat, and the defeat of the demons and return of Indra and the gods to heaven as the rising sun on the spring equinox. Yet Angkor Wat also encodes a deeper spiritual meaning. Its steep stairways leading up the temple and symbolic peaks of Mount Meru represent the path to enlightenment, which we call the path of the spiritual sun. They are believed to signify the difficulty of ascending to heaven, which would mean the ascent of Indra and the gods at the spring equinox represents a stage on the path to enlightenment, when someone overcomes darkness within themselves to attain light. As we explain in our book Ancient Solstice, the equinox symbolizes the point of balance upon which everything pivots in its motion, in the universe, in the cycles of the seasons, and within ourselves, as so magnificently portrayed at Angkor Wat. On either side of the equinox is the duality of darkness and light, of death, descent, and decay, versus birth, ascent, and life. The back and forth between them is the basis of creation and all its cycles. It also represents the struggle between good and evil in the world, within us and on the spiritual path. This is why Jesus and Osiris face their greatest confrontation with darkness to attain immortality at the equinox, as did the Hindu gods led by Indra. It's also why the sun god Horus is shown in a perpetual struggle against the god of darkness Set, in a scene very similar to that of the churning of the Milky Ocean, as Hancock and Fire have noted. In the story, the churning of the Milky Ocean firstly produces a terrible poison. This represents the vices like anger, greed, and arrogance that arise in response to the difficulties in life caused by the struggle between light and darkness. Shiva steps forward to swallow this poison, representing one's higher being that has the power to destroy them. For those who can overcome their inner poisons with the help of their being, next are the treasures, which are the spiritual virtues received as a result. Finally comes the nectar of immortality, the eternal life of the spirit, and the attainment of heaven if one can complete the churning process of life. Moving on now to what is perhaps the most famous ancient site in the world. The Great Sphinx faces due east, so that on the equinox it looks directly at the sun as it rises over the horizon. This alignment and what it symbolizes ties in with the most central spiritual belief of ancient Egypt. The Sphinx is a great symbol of spiritual resurrection, which was the focus of ancient Egyptian religion for thousands of years. It's part of a symphony of astronomical alignments that occurred at the spring equinox and which stretch back thousands of years into the past, just as they do at Angkor Wat. These alignments, together with ancient Egyptian texts, tell us what the Sphinx and the spring equinox meant. The authors Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval realized that because of precession, for a period lasting just over 2,000 years, recurring approximately every 26,000 years, At the spring equinox, the Sphinx would have gazed toward the constellation of Leo, which rose due east an hour before the sun. Leo looks like a recumbent lion, and so the Sphinx would have also aligned to its own celestial image. The last time this occurred was between 10,970 to 8,810 BC. Additionally, they discovered that key features in the sky during this time period were replicated on the ground, much like they had been at Angkor Wat, and at the same time. The Nile River corresponded to the Milky Way, and the peaks of the Great Pyramids to the three stars in Orion's belt, with Orion representing Osiris, the most central god of ancient Egypt. Together with the rising sun and Leo, these alignments symbolize some of the main parts of the story of the resurrection of Osiris. This story is essentially told in the oldest texts in Egypt, which are among the oldest texts in the world, the Pyramid texts. They were written on the walls of pyramids in which kings were entombed, where they narrated the out-of-body journey the king made after death to reach heaven. The king, who took the role of Osiris, was said to rise from out of the underworld with his father the sun, just as the sun rises above the horizon at the spring equinox, spiritually resurrecting and attaining immortality in the afterlife, and then travelling the Milky Way's path to heaven in the northern circumpolar stars, the same place heaven is located in Hinduism. Remarkably, as Hancock and Bouval discovered, it's as though this journey, as it was viewed as occurring in the sky, was mirrored on the ground by the main Giza monuments. Yet the Sphinx as a human-headed lion doesn't fit the story, and it's clear to any observer that the head of the Sphinx is way too small for its body, indicating it has been recarved, perhaps multiple times. Recovering its earlier form is important if we want to understand its full meaning. Another deity who could be shown lying in recumbent pose, just like the Sphinx, is the ancient wolf-headed, once thought to be jackal-headed, judge of the deceased in the afterlife, Anubis. In the pyramid texts, he plays a key role in resurrecting Osiris by enabling him to ascend to heaven. These clues point to what the head of the Sphinx is likely to have earlier been. It was these kinds of clues that led the authors Robert and Olivia Temple to discover extensive evidence for the Sphinx having once taken the form of Anubis, which they've documented in their book, The Sphinx Mystery. It was thought there were no references to the Great Sphinx in the pyramid texts, a strange anomaly, given they refer to the Giza site. But once they realized it was Anubis, and not a giant lion or human-headed lion we should be searching for, they discovered numerous passages describing it. For example, in ancient times the site of the Great Pyramids where the Sphinx lies was called Rostau, the sacred land, and the necropolis. In the pyramid text it refers to Anubis as Lord of Rostau, Anubis who presides over the sacred land, and he at the head of the necropolis, which the temples propose are all ancient references to Anubis as the Sphinx, presiding over the Giza Plateau as it does. The pyramid texts describe how Osiris resurrects by rising out of the underworld in the embrace of his father Atum. They also describe Atum as having the face of Anubis. The temples realize this strange description is referring to the Great Sphinx. The reason they say the body is said to belong to Atum, but the face to Anubis, is because the Sphinx had once been surrounded by a small lake fed from the Nile River, making its body appear like an island. This is connected to the ancient Egyptian myth of creation, which says that in the beginning a primordial mound of earth arose from the primeval waters. This mound is essentially described as a small island, and the god Atum could be portrayed as a primordial mound. When the Sphinx was submerged, the body looked like the mound of Atum in the water, and the only distinct feature that would have been visible from a distance was its Anubis face. The waters surrounding the Sphinx were also a symbol of the netherworld, which Osiris is said to resurrect from, and I'll explain in a moment why Osiris is described as rising from these waters in the embrace of Atum. However, Atum could sometimes be symbolized by a lion, and perhaps this is why the Sphinx developed a lion's body. The temples locate many references to the Sphinx's Anubis in ancient Egyptian texts. As another example, they highlight a passage in the later Coffin text that mentions the deity who presides over a sacred waterway that is described both as a god of the rising sun and as Dogface, whose shape is big. But there is still more to the Sphinx, as on its chest is a mysterious bulge. As mentioned, the pyramid texts say that Osiris rises in the embrace of the Sphinx's Atum. The bulge is located between the paws of the Sphinx in its embrace, and so I realized it must have been referring to a time when this bulge was a carving of Osiris, though now weathered beyond recognition. It would have symbolized him in the embrace of his father Atum and between the hands of Anubis as he resurrected from the waters of the underworld. I call this the Sphinx Osiris theory. A tradition of portraying kings between the paws of sphinxes was common in Egypt, and there is even an Anubis sphinx with the king between its paws that was included as part of the Ramesseum around 1250 BC. This is mirrored in the sky, as a brighter star in Leo is named Regulus, which in Latin means little king, though in Babylonian was known simply as the king. It's positioned at the chest of Leo, right where I think the King of Kings Osiris would have been carved on the Sphinx. Remarkably, Bauval and Hancock discovered that at the spring equinox during the age of Leo between 10,970 to 8,810 BC, the sun would have appeared to rise toward the king's star at Leo's chest, enacting the king resurrecting into the arms of the Sphinx, and note that a freestanding statue of a king is known to have once stood between its paws. We believe the rising of the sun toward the king's star of Leo enacted the resurrection of Osiris together with the sun from out of his coffin in the underworld, in the embrace of Atum, and at the hands of Anubis. If the Sphinx had been surrounded by a lake, as the temples propose, the statue of Osiris on the chest of the Sphinx would have been partly submerged, symbolizing his resurrection from the waters of the underworld, just like the sun emerging due east across the Nile at the equinox. Anubis was sometimes portrayed as lying on the coffin of Osiris, where he was said to guard the gateway to heaven. This same configuration is found at the Giza Plateau, where it's as though the Sphinx does sit atop the coffin of Osiris, as his symbolic tomb lies at the bottom of the so-called Osiris shaft, which has its entrance near the Sphinx. The scales of divine judgment Anubis tends in the afterlife are a symbol of the equinoxes, illustrating the balance between night and day, associating him with the equinox which the Sphinx looks toward. Only when these scales were balanced, so that one's heart weighed no more than the feather of truth, could they resurrect and attain immortality, further revealing that the equinox was seen as a symbolic time of spiritual resurrection. Additionally, in ancient Egyptian texts, the journey someone took to reach resurrection occurred through the 12 hours of the night, which they first had to pass through the darkness of the underworld, full of entities representing their own vices, which they had to defeat. And the only times in the year that night and day are equally 12 hours in length is at the equinoxes. The Egyptians believed that the porthole one passed through as they resurrected to reach heaven was located in the east, at the place of the sun's rising. We believe it was due east, where the sun rose on the equinox, being the place where the Sphinx gazes and thus guards. On the Giza Plateau, as the older form of the Sphinx, Anubis stood at the mystical gateway between the earthly and eternal realm, found in the moment of transition between winter and spring on the dawning of the spring equinox, letting only those who met the spiritual requirements pass. Indeed, his form once guarded the entire site, where he symbolically allowed entrance only to those initiates who met the grade. Pyramids are where this resurrection was believed to take place. The Egyptologist James P. Allen, who has translated the pyramid texts, describes them as resurrection machines, designed to resurrect the spirit of the deceased king to eternal life. Though as mentioned and explained in our books, we believe there is evidence the Great Pyramids were used for rituals of spiritual resurrection for the living, which were later adapted for the dead, when the understanding of spiritual resurrection was lost and believed to be something that happened only in the afterlife. This idea that the Sphinx symbolizes spiritual resurrection and was therefore carved as Anubis, possibly with Osiris at his chest, two gods central to the teachings on resurrection in ancient Egypt, my husband and I put forward as the Sphinx resurrection theory in 2012. The connection between spiritual resurrection and the spring equinox may trace back into the very distant past. Because of precession, the Great Sphinx not only aligned to the spring equinox and Leo around 10,500 BC, but also 26,000 years prior, around 36,500 BC. According to the researcher Armando Mai, the alignments of the Giza monuments proposed by Bauval and Hancock were even more accurate at this time, and the most accurate they could be anywhere in the last 100,000 years. The date of 36,500 BC coincides more closely to the dates the ancient Egyptians gave to the beginning of their civilization, when they said the gods lived on Earth. And it also matches the extent of the weathering that can be seen on the Great Sphinx and its enclosure, which, as John Anthony West and geologist Robert Schoch realized, could only be caused by rainfall. Yet rains capable of such weathering stopped falling in Egypt thousands of years prior to when it's believed to have been built. By comparing rates of limestone weathering to the extent of weathering on the Sphinx, which is carved out of the limestone bedrock, the researcher Randall Carlson estimated the Sphinx could be 20 to 40,000 years old, which is in line with the dates given by the Egyptians to the start of their civilization and to the astronomical alignments of the Giza monuments. Yet even though its form eroded and changed over long ages, the understanding of the Sphinx connection to spiritual resurrection was preserved. This is evidenced in the so-called dream stele erected between its paws by King Thutmose IV in 1401 BC after it spoke to him in a dream and he then cleared it of sand. The name it's given on this stele is Horus of the Horizon. In the pyramid text, this is the same name given to the king as he rose above the eastern horizon, spiritually resurrecting. We now travel to the largest ancient monument in Ireland, which houses the largest collection of megalithic artwork in Europe. Noth is an approximately 2.5-acre man-made mound believed to have been built around 3200 BC. It has 2 inner chambers accessed by inner passages, one facing east and the other west. Both used to align to the sun, though are now too badly damaged to do so today. When they were built, the light of the rising sun would have entered the eastern chamber 6 days after the equinox, while the light of the setting sun had entered the western chamber approximately 18 days before the equinox. The reason for this offset has been suggested by Charles Scrivener, who says these alignments could have been used to predict the solstices and equinoxes using lunar months. For example, the western passage is aligned to sunset 13 lunar months before the following spring equinox. The eastern passage is the longest megalithic passage in Europe and leads to the largest megalithic chamber in Ireland. Within a recess off the chamber, there is a large stone cauldron-shaped basin engraved with a symbol of the sun. It's been associated with the Dagda cauldron of Irish mythology, which is said to have had the power to regenerate life so that dead bodies could be placed into it and drawn out alive and whole again, symbolizing resurrection. This scene is portrayed on the ancient Celtic Gundestrup cauldron. The chamber is cruciform in shape, bringing together the symbol of the cross and theme of resurrection at sunrise on the spring equinox, thousands of years before Jesus. As in Egypt, the builders of Noth located their site along a river, in this case the River Boyne, which they likewise associated with the Milky Way, and aligned their sacred site to a time very near spring equinox, using symbols of resurrection. As we describe in our books, the ancient passage mounds of Europe were based on the same symbolism as Egyptian pyramids, and some were used for similar ancient rituals. Surviving references in Old Celtic and Norse literature indicate that chambered mounds like Noth had been used for a ritual of resurrection as part of an ancient tradition of spiritual initiation, which kings had to undergo in order to rule. Maria Kvilhaug, who is an expert in Norse mythology, has identified some of the key themes in the Norse version of this tradition, saying that the initiate had to descend into the underworld where they face various trials, having to overcome entities and obstacles representing their own hatred, fear, and greed, before being transformed in the embrace of the sun goddess, and then resurrecting and returning to the world, often as a sage or king. This is very similar to the journey the Egyptian initiate had to make through the underworld, where they also had to face entities representing their vices before resurrecting. Kvilhaug says this path of initiation was first staked out by the most important god of Norse religion, Odin, in the most central event of his life, in which he goes through a death-like experience while hanging on the world tree as an act of self-sacrifice before resurrecting. Moving now to the Americas. Pyramids and mounds are also found across the American continent, and many show evidence of being used like those in Egypt and Europe were. The largest in North America is Monk's Mound, which has a base area roughly the same size as that of the Great Pyramid of Egypt. It is part of an alignment to the rising sun on the spring equinox, and just like the pyramids of Egypt, shows evidence of being connected to beliefs in spiritual resurrection. It is part of the Cahokia Mounds complex, located in the US state of Illinois, that once covered an area of 6 square miles, or 16 square kilometers, making it the largest pre-Columbian site north of Mexico. It contained 120 man-made earthen mounds, and at its zenith was home to around 40,000 inhabitants. On the spring equinox, when standing at the centre of a nearby wood henge, the sun appears to rise from behind Monk's Mound. Though no records of its meaning survive, thankfully there are enough remaining clues to piece together what this alignment may have signified to its builders. Vincent Barrows, who served as Vice President of the Cahokia Archaeological Society, has proposed that because of its shape, the mound was actually built in the shape of a turtle, not unlike other Native American effigy mounds. Among Native North Americans and the Maya of Central America, the turtle was used as a symbol of the earth, as though swimming through the cosmos, just as it was among the ancient Hindus. In Maya religion, it likewise supported the world axis that pointed to the North Celestial Pole, the location of heaven, around which the cosmos turned or churned. But I think the key to understanding Monk's Mound can be found in artifacts uncovered at ancient Maya sites in Mexico and Guatemala, where they also built pyramids aligned to the solstices and equinoxes. One of their most important deities was the first father, Hun-Hunahpu, who was said to have overseen the making of creation and who was represented by both the maize plant and the sun. He is shown in a recurring motif as resurrecting from within the shell of a turtle. In one of the few surviving texts of the ancient Maya, it narrates how First Father was killed in the underworld by the lords of death before resurrecting. And so the turtle represents the earth with its interior underworld inside the hollow of its shell, which First Father, like the sun and shoots of corn, resurrected from. According to scholars of Maya studies, David Friedel, Linda Shell and Joy Parker, his resurrection occurred at dawn. And as described in the work of the ethnographer Gary Gosson, the Tzotzil Maya of Mexico came to identify their sun god with Christ after the Spanish conquest, and believe he enters the darkness of the earth at sunset in the west at his time of death, then travels south through the darkness before rising triumphantly in the east at sunrise, later ascending to heaven at noon. I think these Maya beliefs indicate that the sun, which appears to rise from within the turtle-shaped Monk's Mound due east at dawn on the spring equinox, very likely symbolizes spiritual resurrection of First Father or equivalent Cahokian deity. Many of the artifacts illustrating the resurrection of First Father were found at the ancient Maya site of Tikal in Guatemala, where there is yet another ancient pyramid aligned to the spring equinox. Here the tall pyramid-style temples raise majestically above the canopy of the rainforest, made famous in the Star Wars film A New Hope. On the equinox, the sun rises behind the Temple of the Great Jaguar, also called simply Temple 1, and when looking towards Temple 1 from nearby Temple 3, the rising spring equinox sun appears to crown its peak. This temple entombed the Maya king Djoser Chan Kawil I, just as many pyramids entombed the kings of ancient Egypt, and for the same reason, as pyramids were seen as facilitating their spiritual resurrection in the afterlife. The Maya king assumed the spiritual role of a jaguar, which was a symbol of the night sun, believed to be the form the sun took in the journey through the underworld during the hours of the night, just as the kings of Egypt assumed the role of the sun god Ra, who journeyed through the hours of the night through the underworld before resurrecting. The pyramid has 9 terraces, symbolizing the 9 regions of the underworld in Maya cosmology. And so the site symbolizes the resurrection of the Jaguar king from out of the underworld as a rising spring equinox sun. Temple 1 was decorated with a wooden lintel depicting a jaguar with water lilies sprouting from its head. Although the meaning of the water lily jaguar remains obscure, the symbol of the water lily or lotus has parallels in other remnants of the religion of the sun. For example, one of the most important symbols in ancient Egypt was the blue water lily, which opens only during the day, closing and sinking beneath the water at night, just like the sun. Because of this, it was used to symbolize the resurrection of the sun, and passages of ancient Egyptian texts recount how kings would resurrect by being symbolically transformed into water lilies. It was also one of the most important symbols in India, often used to symbolize the rising of the eternal spirit from out of the mud of materiality. I believe the symbol of the water lily jaguar that adorns the Jaguar pyramid symbolizes the resurrection of the night sun from out of the underworld at the spring equinox. One other fascinating site worth mentioning is the largest ancient temple discovered in Europe. It's called Nebelivka Temple and is located in Ukraine. It no longer stands, but its foundations were discovered in 2012. It was built around 4000 BC by the Cucuteni Tripilia people, who had lived across Ukraine, Moldova and Romania. its main axis aligned to the equinox sunrise, so that the light of the sun entered the temple and lit up its central altar. Other altars within the temple aligned to sunrise on the winter and summer solstices. As we've seen, there were numerous gods in different parts of the world that were portrayed as resurrecting at the spring equinox. For some who saw the deeper meaning of these symbolic stories, they represented a stage on the spiritual path in which the candidate went through spiritual resurrection within themselves. This path was central to the ancient religion of the sun, which spread across the world, and is why the same symbols with the same meaning can be found in places as far apart as Egypt, Ireland, Cambodia, and the Americas. Jesus is also recorded as having resurrected around the spring equinox. He was said to have been crucified at the time of the Jewish festival of Passover and resurrected days later. This would have occurred within a few weeks of the spring equinox in the Northern Hemisphere, and so his resurrection is still celebrated around the time of spring equinox at Easter. Jesus is said to have predicted his resurrection when he said that when the temple was destroyed, meaning his body, he would raise it in 3 days. There is evidence that Jesus not only knew he would be crucified and resurrect, but that he actually prearranged it. For instance, in the ancient Gnostic text, the Gospel of Judas, it recounts a conversation in which Jesus takes Judas apart from the other disciples as the most advanced among them to secretly arrange his betrayal. This text is thought to have been written in the 2nd century AD and then banned and lost for over 1,500 years. It was rediscovered in Egypt before later being published in English by National Geographic in 2006. As numerous researchers have noted, the events of Jesus' life correspond to the path of the sun, as those of many ancient sun gods did. For instance, in a video I made about the spiritual meaning of the winter solstice, I explained how sun gods were often said to have been born at the winter solstice and how this symbolized the birth of a higher part of someone's being within their consciousness at a stage on the spiritual path. Ancient people represented this higher being using the sun as the divine light of heaven. At the autumn equinox, another part of the path was shown, as these ancient sun gods were often said to have been killed and then descended into the underworld at this time, as this is when darkness becomes greater than light in the sun's annual journey. Jesus and Osiris were both killed through betrayal. First father Hun-Hunahpu of the Maya was killed by the lords of the underworld through deceit. Odin of the Norse went through a death-like experience as an act of self-sacrifice, sharing many similarities with Jesus. All were then said to have descended into the underworld before resurrecting. This represents a stage on the path when the initiate with the sun within is persecuted and physically destroyed in some way by the evil of the world and plunged into the dark underworld of their psyche. The sun descending across the celestial equator at the autumn equinox creates a cross on which the spiritual sun is symbolically crucified. In the Gospels, Jesus is stripped of his clothes and possessions, and the sun is described as darkening, representing the loss of his power. His binding to the cross symbolizes the suffering of the spirit within the material, four-dimensional world. I'll explain much more about the autumn equinox in an upcoming video. After his crucifixion, Jesus is said to have descended into the underworld, largely based on his saying that he would spend 3 days and nights in the heart of the earth. These 3 days correspond to the 3 days when the sun appears to stand still at the winter solstice, as this is when darkness is at its maximum, representing the spiritual sun in the very center of the earth, symbolic of matter, the underworld, human body, and subconscious. Then, in the oldest account of his resurrection, Jesus is described as having risen, just like the sun, which as mentioned would have occurred near the spring equinox. Many believe the similarities between Jesus' life and the path of the sun exist because he was merely a recycled ancient sun god whose life was made up based on the solar year. But we offer a different explanation, which is that Jesus was going through the path of the spiritual sun at an advanced level. His life served his own spiritual development and as a teaching that symbolically showed the spiritual path to others, just as the lives of other teachers of the religion of the sun, like Osiris, had done before him. There is a lot of historical evidence that Jesus really existed, and there are clues he spent his lost years with a secret initiatory order that helped him arrange his resurrection. It would explain, for instance, the mysterious man in the white robe who appears in the empty tomb to announce his resurrection and instructs his followers on what to do next. I'll explain more about this in an upcoming video. As illustrated at Angkor Wat, both darkness and light play essential roles in the cycles of nature and in the progress of the soul or consciousness through them. In the story of the churning of the Milky Ocean, the demons who tug on one end of the serpent are the darkness that provides the necessary opposition to those striving for light. It's by overcoming darkness that one forges spiritual treasures within and eventually attains spiritual resurrection. This tells us that by facing darkness in life, we develop things like love, courage, and understanding, while simultaneously overcoming the dark energy of hatred, fear, and ignorance, thereby transforming who we are. Without darkness, without that opposition, there can be no learning and no transformation. At the winter solstice, symbolized by the birth of many sun gods, the spiritual sun is born within a spiritually prepared person. Yet that light is born into the time of greatest darkness and death, representing the darkness of a human being without the divine light and life of its higher being. The influence of one's higher being starts small, just like a baby, but gradually grows within them just as the days lengthen toward the equinox, until after great hardships, that darkness is overpowered by light, and the life of the divine seems to spring forth within inert matter, like the beautiful blossoms of spring from the earth. The spirit within, which gives eternal life, is reached by those who are prepared to go through great trials and suffering, and to give up the darkness and evil within their own psyche for the treasures of the spirit, which are everlasting. This is demonstrated in the symbolic stories of death, descent, and resurrection found in the religion of the sun. Celebrating the spring equinox puts us in touch with this ancient wisdom, which is as timeless as the seasons themselves. While most may not attain the lofty status of spiritual resurrection in this lifetime, all those who work to increase light in themselves and in the world are part of the great churning of the Milky Ocean that is perpetually in motion, and the spring equinox represents the times when the light and life of the spirit overcomes the darkness and wins. This video is part of a series about the ancient meaning of the solstices and equinoxes. You can find my video about the winter solstice in the description, and I'll be making videos about the summer solstice and autumn equinox in the coming months. I'll also be making videos about how to celebrate these times of year based on ancient traditions and their deeper spiritual meaning. If you'd like to delve into these topics in more detail, you can do so in our book, Ancient Solstice.